Welcome to the Game Changer Experience podcast. We're your hosts, Dr. Jeremy Pastor and Dr. Dave Kim. On this episode, we're going to talk about the truth about balance, what it is, what it's not, and how we train it. So come check it out. You are listening to the Game Changer Experience podcast, where we talk about rehab, performance, and everything in between. This is where we help you navigate common questions and misconceptions in the training and rehab world.
All right, Jeremy, let's talk about, what do you think about balance today? I think a lot of people in many clinics and on social media, they view balance as like standing on their single leg, trying to, stand up with all their might. They start tensing muscles and, they stand on RX pads and really try to challenge themselves in that way. But let's try to clarify what balance means in our eyes and maybe talk about some scenarios in the clinic where we didn't have to utilize strategies like that per se, but, we still improve balance.
Sure. I think the way that most people look at balance is almost just identifying it as like a very non-specific, any strategy needed to stay upright and not fall. I don't think that that's wrong necessarily. I think that there's the safety component to it, right? Like the protective element to balance, which is just that, which is, can we teach the person to not fall in situations that maybe they're like a falling hazard? But then when you extrapolate that to quote unquote training balance as like a training quality, I think that's where things start to get a little bit like lost in translation. So I guess the real quick example would be like a story I would have about a recent patient. So I saw a patient who was in her 70s, probably almost 80 years old. And she had a pretty like typical long history, and she was dealing with some weakness and general stiffness that would come with age and come with her long injury and medical history. So nothing seemed like out of the ordinary, but she had absolutely done years and years on and off of PT. And when asking her about her experience, it was fairly predictable, right? It's like, I was told that I have tight this, I was told that I have weak this, I was told my balance is bad, and almost to the point where I could predict her entire program, having never even assessed her yet. So, we decided to kind of talk about balance with respect to like, where do you feel like you don't have very good balance? I think that's a really important question. It's like, what is it that's telling you that you don't have good balance? Is it just the fact that when you lift one leg, you can't stand on that leg for 30 seconds or 60 seconds? Or is there something about a specific activity that you maybe feel less stable or like you're falling in a certain direction? I think getting that level of specificity of like, what is it that the patient's identifying as feeling less balanced, it was really important. And the information that she provided for me was basically two main things. It was when she would first stand up after sitting down, she felt very wobbly, her words, right? And then the other thing was sometimes when I walk, I feel like I drag one leg. So it's like, okay, automatically hearing those things, I say, okay, yes, that's balance, right? But also that to me sounds like a strategy that's capable of changing. So then it's like, are we actually trying to treat her balance, so to speak, or if I could teach her a more effective strategy to execute those activities that she's perceiving as being imbalanced with, right? What change can we make? So this was day one for almost an 80-year-old who doesn't have a training background, who I had never met previously. We just worked on her strategy for getting out of the chair, right? And all I did was teach her how to kind of, let's say, produce force into the ground, push through her feet, and where to push from. And her eyes widened, her husband's eyes widened. And she was like, that feels like completely normal. I don't feel as weak. I feel balanced. I feel stable. I feel like I could stand up and just start walking. And I was like, that's pretty cool, right? All we did was kind of teach her, like, what does it actually mean to stand up, right? Like, where are we trying to push from? Meanwhile, over the decades on and off of PT, I'm sure she's done an exercise called a sit to stand, which she said, I've done 30, 40, 50 of these as an exercise. And it's like, well, what were you trying to do when executing that exercise? So to kind of like tie this back to your question, it's like, what is balance? Like, how do we train? It's like, for her, that exercise became a balance exercise because we taught her a strategy to better manage like how she's producing force into the ground, right? It's how well can I keep my center of gravity within my base of support, and then the specificity, or I should say the specificity of the context comes in with respect to which specific activity we're talking about, right? It could be a squat, right? It could be a lunge. It could be any other kind of like traditional exercise you see in the gym. Everything has a balance component. It just comes down to identifying like how well you can manage your base of support.
Yeah, so I think you frame that perfectly in the sense that, everything really is a balance activity and we're always managing gravity. And so if somebody is not good at being a gravity manager, then the way they put force down into the floor will be affected. And so I think just teaching her the basics, even if it's like an everyday activity, like a sit to stand, right? Like if you teach her the right contacts and how to actually put force down is going to be far more useful than like having them potentially stand on one foot. Now, when it comes to, I guess, balance, what I think of is I kind of compare it to like a car GPS, right? Like for a GPS to function, you need 3 satellites or many more satellites. You need something that will kind of provide information to a central processing unit that kind of will tell you where you are in space, where you're going to, how long it's going to take to get there, what's around your surroundings. And to compare that to the human body, like there are so many similarities, right? Like balance can be affected by the visual system. Balance can be affected by the proprioceptive system. Balance can be affected by the vestibular system. So it's a matter of like how those systems kind of speak to each other, how those systems integrate with each other that kind of allow your brain to feel safe in the process. And so, for example, it's like I had a patient who, this is recent, and I posted this post recently on Instagram about the woman who the lazy eye opened up, right? Her medical history consists of like severe scoliosis that the doctors couldn't manage well and basically told her like, hey, this is going to be you for the rest of your life. And then, she had back pain, elbow pain, all sorts of pain. But the one interesting thing in her history was she had an eye infection and then it eventually ended up developing a lazy eye. And for my thinking process, after going through her history extensively and trying to put it together, it's like, hey, maybe when that eye became lazy, her whole system did not feel safe there. And so it kind of reoriented towards a space where she felt much safer. And that, again, is the right side for her because it was on the left side where the lazy eye was. And then maybe over time, her body just kind of started to adapt to where she felt safe. And that's how scoliosis happened, right? That's a management of gravity. And that's a strategy the body takes in order to not fall. Because again, like when it comes to survival, we don't want to fall on our faces. The number one, goal is for us to survive. We need to eat food. We need to, make sure we protect our lives. And especially as you get older, not falling becomes a much greater priority. And so going back to this story with the girl, it's like maybe over time, right, her body started to adapt and then she started maxing out, the spaces she had available within her joints and her body. Maybe that led to more focal stress around the elbows and the low back and the hips and the feet becoming flat. And so I did like a manual technique in the mouth just to expand her palate up top. We did some things where she was looking visually a certain way, tongue posture was a certain way, jaw position was a certain way. And we kind of broke it down from the feet going all the way up to the face. And after we did a little bit of that, like her lazy eye opened up, which was pretty incredible. And that wasn't what we were going for. That's not why she came to PT. And I had told her from the start, like I noticed the lazy eye, but again, like I don't know if we're going to fix this or not. If it ends up opening, great. That's a cherry on top. But by providing the right stimulus to her and allowing her to sense things that she hasn't sensed before and giving her a favorable input, her eye was able to open up. So going back to balance, again, it's a culmination of many systems kind of working together. to feel safe and to understand where you are in space, right? Like where you're oriented. And then from there, it's like, okay, what is the task you're trying to complete? And if your body doesn't have these options available and, these systems aren't integrating well, then yeah, you're going to feel anxious. Your muscles are going to tense up. And the more you're tensed up, then you can't rotate well, you can't move well. And generally speaking, you just don't feel safe walking or even standing.
Yeah, and to be honest, the changes you made with that one patient were very, no pun intended, like eye-opening, right? It was very cool to see. And you had said one thing that I think made a lot of sense. Like you helped her sense, right, what she was doing, right? Let's summarize. You helped her sense where her body is in space. And I think that's also part of the deficiency in how many people try to retrain balance. What I mean by that is, if we want to just like really simplify what balance is, it's how well we can keep our center of gravity within our base of support. When we say base of support, almost picture the space between both of your feet, right? And then your center of gravity being a point right at midline, like your belly button pushing straight down between those 2 points, right? If we can keep that somewhere between our 2 feet, at the very least, we won't fall to the left or right. And obviously we're oversimplifying this. Our center of gravity also has the ability to move forward and back in any direction, right? But we want to basically keep this downward point within our base so that we can stay upright in space. Now, as we narrow our feet, right? So let's just say we went from a really wide stance to a narrower stance. We are shortening, right? Or we are making smaller our base of support just because of the context of now the position that we're in. So that downward point now has to fall within a much smaller space. If we continue to narrow it, so whether we're in, let's just say like a more traditional, like lunge position, or if you're familiar with any type of balance training, like a tandem stance, right? And we narrow that base even more. Now we are challenging our ability to keep our center of gravity within our base even more. That's kind of the concept between some of these more progressed positions. Now let's go into a single leg position. Right now, our base is almost like standing on a peg leg, right? We have one single point on the ground that we need to kind of keep our center of gravity perfectly centered over so that we don't fall in any direction. Now, how some people progress is we throw something under the foot like a foam pad. Now, here's my biggest issue in doing these things. One, there's a somewhat beneficial element to, again, the safety side of it, of just having some type of righting reaction, right? Just doing whatever the body needs to prevent ourselves from falling is potentially protective and useful for some people. But if in some of these earlier stages, if part of what someone's issue is the fact that they're unsure of how to even identify where their center of gravity is, where they're creating pressure into the ground, how to sense the ground with their feet, then throwing their foot on a pad is constantly changing where that pressure is actually going through the foot. And that's going to have a systemic effect mechanically on how well we're actually able to manage our center of gravity. So if we're actually trying to improve somebody's ability to manage their center of gravity, that is something that is making it nearly impossible to do. Beneficial from a protective standpoint, not as beneficial if you're trying to make some of these more systemic type of benefits. So if I'm creating force into the ground, and let's just say I'm trying to create pressure in a very specific aspect of my foot to gain stability and to kind of send that signal up the chain, once I put my foot on the foam pad, right, you're going to be rolling towards the outside of the foot, which is going to naturally lead to some type of influence higher up the chain, right? Foot's going to tell the shin, tell the femur, tell the hip what to do, right? You might roll towards the inside of the foot. And now you're just challenging your body's ability to basically sway, right? Like a tall building in the wind, to just basically narrow the sway enough that you don't fall, right? So when I think about what actually is useful to train somebody's balance, first off, I can't actually say the last time that I went through someone's assessment and said, wow, your quote unquote balance is bad. That is the goal of what we're doing here. I think it is a byproduct of addressing kind of like the bigger fish that we want to identify. Because if we could look at how somebody's moving and we could identify the fact that based off of their movements or their movement limitations or the orientation of their body, right, their center of gravity is getting pushed or pulled in any particular direction. And I speak in a lot of different ways and different podcasts and different areas about how important the center of gravity is on pretty much everything we do from a movement standpoint. We can reverse engineer our assessment to identify what somebody is doing with their center of gravity. So if we could attack these things in whatever the most appropriate position or appropriate exercise to intervene for that purpose, you are going to get a trickle down effect of actually improving how stable they are in certain positions. Right. For example, because I think that it's important to kind of provide context, let's just use like a split squat or a stationary lunge visual as an example. It's not uncommon for people to say when one leg is in front versus the other leg that they feel different, right? They feel different. It's like, okay, well, tell me what you mean. Well, I feel less stable or I feel less balanced when this leg's in front versus this one. This one feels a lot easier to do. It's like, okay, well, what is changing in those two different positions, right? If our center of gravity is going to be, let's say, drifting in one direction, and then we want to narrow that base of support as we're further challenging our ability to move in the direction that we're basically already getting pushed. Sometimes, and again, we're talking extremes as a visual, your brain is going to think that you're getting pushed so far outside of that base that it's not going to know how to kind of keep yourself from falling. Whereas if you flip the orientation, you put the other side in front, it's like, okay, well, you have enough wiggle room on this side that you don't feel like you're falling, but it's still going to feel different than the other side. So just with a split squat as an example, which most people would just call that a lower body exercise, if we can identify and also put them in the right position with the right variation, creating the right pressures, and now we can get them to feel the same things on both sides. We just made the same change that you're trying to make by getting someone to basically stand on one leg for an extended period of time. We just did it in a way where they could actually use this as they walk out of the clinic within the context of whatever the activity they're trying to improve is.
Right. Yeah, I think you ended it perfectly. Like, we need to make this useful and meaningful for the person we're working with. Like, sure. If balance is truly an issue and they have a problem like sensing the right things, right? Sensing the right pressures in the foot and, being in the right positions to effectively put force into the floor, like, quite frankly, I just feel like we're wasting time, right? Because like we could do all the RX pad drills we want, but as soon as they go home, contextually speaking, they're not walking on RX pad floors, right? It's hardwood floors or carpet or whatever. But yeah, I mean, so again, when we are training balance, I think it's very important for them to sense the right things, put them in the right positions, but also train your visual system, assess for it, train the vestibular system, different head positions with different eye positions. Because again, eye muscles are very strong and it could in fact influence the cranium as well. And so all those things play a part into, where am I in space from the patient standpoint?
But here's my stance on that too, because I think that all that stuff's extremely valuable, right? And I've tested and intervened on those things with a lot of people as well. But even think about kind of the chicken or the egg scenario, right? Like, we know that there's a lot of different components to what would allow somebody to maintain their balance, right? You kind of hit on the different systems, but it still doesn't tell you what that kind of, we'll call lowest hanging fruit is to be able to get the trickle down to affect the system that you're trying to affect. What I mean by that is, now, kind of like you said, this was not my intention to create this change, but it was a byproduct of creating the changes that I made, right? I helped somebody manipulate their center of gravity through a certain exercise that would otherwise look like, let's just call it like a bridge type variation, right? Laying on their back with their legs up on a surface. It's like we worked on very specific positions and postures in that position, and they stood up and we saw a change in their visual system. Right. So my point in saying that is that even though those other systems are definitely an influence in how well somebody is able to stay upright against gravity, it doesn't necessarily mean that the input has to specifically target that system in order to create a change there. And I think that that's also a part of what people miss as they're trying to progress these I'll call them random, like balance activities. It's okay. We know the progression, right? You stand on one foot, you stand on one foot on a pad. Maybe you stand on one foot on a BOSU. You stand on one foot on one of those elements and someone's throwing something to you. You stand on one foot on one of those elements and someone's pushing you. It's like, it's being so literal in the intervention of what you're trying to address. And it's kind of missing the boat on what somebody needs to create the change that they think they're creating. So, it's not downplaying the fact that all those things still exist. It just might not be the most direct and even safe way to almost hit multiple things with one stone. It's being way too literal. And then you might even be missing the boat, because then you have to ask yourself, in order to execute that like incredibly complex activity, how are they actually executing that movement? Right? What are they doing to stay upright? Like you said at the very beginning, it's like they're creating a lot of tension to create stiffness, because if I'm stiff as a board, right, you can't push me, right? It's like a reflexive tension, right? Like you want to stay upright. So you're creating tension at the right time to not sway. It's like, okay, so then the strategy that they're using to do this really complex movement, what if that strategy is creating tension in a way that's negatively influencing the things that actually are going to help them produce the right force into the ground? It's kind of like 2, 3, 4 layers deep that you have to look at some of these things, right? And I don't think that enough people pay attention to some of those, we'll call secondary consequences, right? Like that's kind of like a nice thing that Bill used to say, right? It's like, some of those secondary consequences, to where it's like, okay, in a vacuum, it's not the world's worst exercise. We could find a context to where it might be useful, but what are the trade-offs of the strategy they're using to execute that? And could you have found a better way to get the same outcome that you're looking for in a way that they could actually execute it more appropriately?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that was perfect in the sense that, like, find the lowest hanging fruit, find the safest activity. And again, like, even if you work down below, maybe let's say the feet and the hips, it could have profound influences up until, up into the cranium, the eyes, the visual system, all of that. So it's really important to kind of, once you provide an input, look for that output, see how it kind of influences the rest of the system. Because again, people want to view the body as like, isolated parts, but in theory, it's all connected. So you just have to be, vigilant and look out for these things. But
yeah, so I think this was a good discussion, just kind of, let's say, debunking maybe some myths surrounding balance, and maybe just like what people believe balance to be, and what kind of typical ways that people go about trying to train balance. So, I think it was a fun conversation. On the next episode, we get to debunk, another very common topic, which is the topic of posture, which I think we could talk about for probably hours on end, but we'll still try to keep it short. So if you enjoyed this episode, definitely come back next week when we talk about posture, and we could talk about some other common things that we don't necessarily agree upon in the PT world. All right, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for catching today's episode. If you liked it, save it, share it, and leave a 5-star review. It helps us get the message out to more people just like you. We'll see you guys on the next episode.